Welcome to Justified Posteriors, the podcast that updates priors about the economics of AI and technology. I'm Seth Benzel, possessing superhuman levels in the ability to be persuaded, coming to you from Chapman University in sunny Southern California.
And I'm Andre Fratkin, preferring to be persuaded by the 200-word abstract rather than the 100-word abstract, coming to you from rainy Cambridge, Massachusetts.
That's an interesting place to start, Andre. Do you enjoy being persuaded? Like, do you actually have do you like the feeling of your view changing, or is it actually unpleasant?
It depends on whether that view is a key part of my identity, Seth.
Mm.
What about yourself?
I think that's fair. If you were to persuade me that I'm actually a woman, or if you were to persuade me that I'm like actually, a Salvadorian, that would probably upset me a lot more than if you were to persuade me that, the sum of two large numbers is different than the sum that I thought that they summed to.
Hey, Seth, I found your birth
Oh
certificate.
no. Oh no, Andre.
And it turns out you're born in El Salvador.
Oh, damn. All right. Well, we're going to cut that one out of the podcast. We'll come back. If any ICE officers hear about this, I'm going to be very, very sad. But I mean, that brings up the idea that, right, which is when you give someone either an information or argument that might change the way they act, it might help them, it might hurt them. And I don't know if you've noticed, Andre, but there are these new digital technologies that are creating a lot of text, and they might persuade people of stuff.
And there are a bunch of people going around that are saying that these things are so persuasive, they're going to destroy society.
ChatGPT is just going to persuade us all to shoot ourselves. The end. One day we'll turn it on. ChatGPT, the response to every post will be this highly compelling argument about why we should just end it now. Everyone will be persuaded, and then the age of the machine. Presumably that's the concern.
Yes. So here's a question for you, Seth. Let's say we had this worry
Okay.
and we wanted to study it. How would you go about doing this?
Well, it seems to me like I'd get together a bunch of humans and try to persuade them with AIs and see how successful I was at it.
Okay, and that seems like a reasonable idea. And which AI would you use?
Well, so now that's interesting, right? Because AI models vary along two dimensions, right? They vary along size, right? So do you have a model with a shit ton of parameters or very few parameters? And they also vary in what you might call taste, right? So how are they fine-tuned for particular tasks? It seems like if you want to persuade someone, you would want a big model, because we usually think bigger, more powerful, as well as a model that's kind of fine-tuned towards the specific thing you're trying to achieve. What about you, Andre?
Well, I'm a little old school, Seth. I'm a big advocate of the experimentation approach.
Okay.
So what I would do is I would run a bunch of experiments to figure out what the most persuasive message is for a certain type of person. And then I'd fine tune the LLM based on that.
Right. So you're now talking about sort of micro-targeting, right? There's sort of two questions here, which is like, can you persuade a generic person in an ad? And then there's the question of, can you persuade this person given enough information about their context?
Yeah. So with that in mind, do we want to kind of state what the questions are and the study that we're considering in this podcast?
That's exactly right. I would love to. Today, we are studying the question of how persuasive are AIs, and more importantly, or perhaps what gives this question particular interest, is not just can AIs persuade people, because we know anything can persuade people. A thunderstorm at the right time can persuade people, or an eclipse or something, all these natural omens. Rather, we're asking, as we make these models bigger, how much better do they get at persuading people, right? So now we've got that flavor of the progressive over time. If you talk to Andre, he does not like studies of things where we're just studying what the AI looks like right now. He wants to try to get something where we're getting the arrow of where the AI is going. And this paper is a great example of that. Would you tell us the title and authors, Andre?
Sure. The title is Scaling Language Model Size Yields Diminishing Returns for Single Message Political Persuasion by Kobe Hackenberg, Ben Tappan, Paul Rutger, Scott Hale, Jonathan Bright, and Helen Margetts. Apologies to the authors for mispronouncing everyone's names.
Amazing. So a crack team coming at this question. I guess maybe before we get too deep into what they do, let's register our priors and tell the audience what we thought about AI persuasion as a potential thing, as an X risk, as just a regular risk. Let's talk about our views. So our first prior we're considering is, do we think that LLMs are going to see reducing returns to scale from increases in parameter count, right? So we all think that, a super tiny model isn't going to be as powerful as the most up-to-date, biggest models. But are there kind of decreasing returns to scale? What do you think of that question, Andre?
Well, let me throw back to our scaling laws episode, Seth. I do believe that the scaling laws that everyone talks about exhibit diminishing returns by definition.
Right. A log-log relationship. Well, let me think about that for a second. Actually, a log-log relationship does not tell you anything about increasing versus decreasing.
Yeah, that's true.
It's
scale-free.
Scale-free.
It's scale. Well, to the extent that each order of magnitude costs an order of magnitude more typically.
Right. So whether the returns are increasing or decreasing depends on which number is bigger to start with.
Yes.
So the short answer is, you wouldn't necessarily expect returns to scale to be a useful way to even approach this problem.
Yeah, sure. I guess let's reframe it a little bit. In any task in statistics, we have diminishing returns, just, law of large numbers, central limit theorem combination. So it would be surprising if the relationship wasn't diminishing. The other kind of thing to say here is that there's a natural cap on persuasiveness, right? Like, if you're already 99% persuasive, there's only so far you can go.
I think if you talk to my friends in my lefty economics readings groups from college, you will realize that there is always a view crazier than the view that you're sitting at.
So yeah, to me, this seems, you can imagine a threshold where if the model gets good enough, it suddenly gets persuasive. But if it's not good enough, it just has zero persuasive value. So I imagine that could exist. But then conditional on it having some persuasive value, I'd imagine that there would be diminishing returns.
Right, there has.
I'd
right,
be pretty
okay.
confident
So
of that.
maybe Andre is making the trivial point that when you go from the model not being able to speak English to it speaking English, there has to be some increasing returns to persuasion there.
Yes, exactly.
But then he thinks once we get onto the curve, there's got to be decreasing returns. What do you think? I'm basically at the same place. I think that if you asked me what is the relationship of model size to any outcome of a model, I would anticipate a log-log relationship, right? So again, Andre brought up our scaling law episode where we talked about how there seems to be this empirical pattern, which is that the models get a constant percent better as you increase the model size by an order of magnitude. It seems like better should include persuasion. So to the extent that this is a principle, you'd expect a log-log relationship. As Andre points out, if one of the things you're logging is gazillions of parameters, and the other thing you're logging is, on a scale of 1 to 100, mechanically there has to be decreasing returns to scale. The log there is going to have really extreme decreasing returns to scale. So I come into this with 99% chance that the relevant domain is decreasing returns to scale.
Well, and I have tremendous respect for the editor of this article.
Yeah, it's Professor Jackson. Yes, everyone's favorite.
Matthew Jackson.
Matt Jackson, if you're listening, you're our favorite.
He's the best. He taught me social network economics.
Great
I do
textbook.
say that it's a bit weird to put a paper in the PNAS that essentially, if you think about it for a second, should not update anyone's beliefs at all.
Well, okay, so now let's move on to our second, right? So on the very narrow question, it seems to make an obvious point. Now let's move to the broader question, right, which is this concern that we led with, which is maybe these super powerful AIs are all going to be used by Vladimir Putin to persuade ourselves to like do something that will destroy our economy, get rid of our workforce, and basically just meme ourselves into destroying our country. And some say that that's already happened, Andre.
Well, look, if it's already happened, it certainly happened without AI. But I have a pretty strong prior on
Okay,
this,
tell me.
which is that persuasion is a social process, right? It's a process of getting signal from different people around you, different sources around you to change your beliefs. And as a result, I think that anything that it's like a one-to-one interaction between a chatbot and a human about something the human already has pretty strong beliefs about is going to have some limits in the persuasive ability, right? Like another way to put it is like people don't even read carefully, right? So, how are you even going to get their attention?
Well, Andre, let me tell.
So,
Okay, you finish your thought.
yeah, so that said, now a highly intelligent AI agent, if they were trying to persuade someone like me, they would come up with a multifaceted strategy, including many different like touch points, right? Like they might try to also plant some ideas into my friends' minds. They might like know which outlets I read and create like a sock puppet account that says, oh, everyone is, doing this, etc. You see what I'm
Right,
saying?
they could like you could get into like this social media bubble that's all AI created, where it creates like this not only the persuasion, but like a bunch of facts that you appear to be socially validated but aren't really, and you could think this whole ecosystem could be very persuasive.
Yes, yes. And I guess we should also say that capitalism is a hyper intelligent
Alien,
system.
alien that reaches on us.
Certainly, capitalism is smarter than any individual.
Would you describe it to a Shoggoth?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I call it the invisible hand.
Oh wow, ooh, that's classy. Did you come up with that one?
But I guess what I would say is that there are plenty of market forces that try to persuade people in all sorts of ways. And what I'll say is that the market hasn't really discovered a way to 100% persuade people. Individual people are persuaded to different degrees, but I think like it's still a massive problem, and the entire field of marketing exists to try to solve it. And I'd say that most of the time it's not very successful. Which is not to say people can't be persuaded, but it's actually really hard to persuade people of specific things, as the market shows.
All right.
Like my product is better than your product,
Right. I mean, in that example, there are people persuading on the other side, which is maybe one of the reasons that we're not super concerned. Let me actually throw this back at you. So to what extent does your relative lack of concern about super persuasive AI agents fucking up society relies on the fact that there'll be super persuasive agents on the other side arguing in the other direction too?
I think to a very large extent, but even that I don't think is that necessary, as long as you're still talking to people in real life and they're not the ones being targeted by the persuasion. That's kind of how I think about it.
So what is your percent chance that super persuasive AIs are the number one AI safety risk?
It's very low.
Really?
Very low, less than 1%.
What's your number one AI safety risk? Bioweapons?
Look, here's another way to put it. The persuasiveness of an AI will be primarily either monetary incentives or blackmail,
right,
which I will not count as persuasive.
Ooh.
Like there are easier ways to get people to do what you want them to do than to persuade.
Unless they're Oracle. I mean, so you're putting like 0 to 1%. All right, fair enough. I came into this claim thinking like about 60%. And let me tell you why. I think the reason why is if we're talking about like really sort of risky AI getting out of control scenarios, they involve a step in which the AI in the box convinces somebody to let them out of the box, right? This is like a classic Yudkowskian Bostrom scenario, right? We got the super AI in the box. It's really useful for us as long as it's in the box, and we have to be really careful to not be persuaded to let it out of the box. That kind of future seems pretty not completely implausible to me. And it seems like it's a step along the path of a lot of the worst AI scenarios, right? So, what are bad AI scenarios? So, one is like disempowerment. The AI, maybe it doesn't like wreck us, but we slowly give it more and more control, either to it or a misaligned AI or to a person who's running the misaligned AI. And like that's going to have a rhetorical persuasion element in it, presenting you evidence that actually you should disempower yourself to the AI.
So I guess I'm going to push back
Okay.
on that. I mean, maybe we're just disagreeing about the definition
Mm.
of persuasion, but me, like, let's say outsourcing certain tasks to the AI right now, it's not because the AI has persuaded me.
Right. Well, but you're not getting disempowered, right? When you have the AI,
I mean, I don't think that this empowerment is like, look, I start thinking that the AI is reliable enough to outsource calendar management to the AI, and then maybe something goes wrong as a result of that. I don't view that as like the AI being persuasive. I can see how you could cast it that way, but primarily that's not about persuasiveness. It's about kind of deception of capabilities.
right. So now we get into, is deception the same thing as persuasion or is it different?
Yeah.
This is kind of like a philosophical question. You might imagine like kind of three related things. So, three related concepts are rhetoric. I'm going to use just pure argument to get you to take a position. I can have a proof. I can actually mathematically or somehow prove that I'm right in a way that's maybe distinct from pure rhetoric, if you think those two things can be separated. Some do, some don't. And then finally, you might imagine like trade for intellectual assets, right? The AI in the box might either say, if you let me out of the box, I will give you this cool intellectual asset, or, avoid doing a negative intellectual thing.
Or I'll just make you some money and, make that person money,
Right. And
right?
so, like, yeah, is that
That
persuasion?
doesn't feel very like persuasion. It just feels
I mean, you
like
persuaded the
what
guy to let you out of
people.
the box for money. I don't know. It seems to me if you've got a demon in the box and the demon in the
Mhm.
box says, I'll give you $100,000 if you let me out, it seems like you were persuaded by the demon.
Okay, good. So this is a very useful
Okay.
discussion. I think this paper, very specifically, and how I was thinking about it, was about the first thing you
Right,
said, which
right.
is simply about a rhetorical argument about the matter at
Mhm.
hand, rather than using extraneous promises and things like that. And it's also about persuading people to believe
Right.
something that's not about the AI itself, right?
Right. So yeah, so now
Now,
maybe this is
those are
okay.
different. There's a different kind
Cool.
of
So let's doot
risks,
doot
right?
doot into discussing the actual experiment.
All right, so what do they do in this paper? It's like a super simple
Hmm.
paper, which is not bad. We like
Simple in a
discussing
good way.
simple papers. Yeah, they're gonna use some LLMs circa 2024. They have 24 language
Hmm.
models. Some of them are worse than others, but I'll just say that the best ones are on the scale of Opus and GPT-4
Yeah.
Turbo.
Same
So
with you.
certainly not as good as the models we're playing around. And they have each of these models, they fine tune them a little bit and they have them generate some persuasive messages about various political
Right, and
questions.
maybe quick aside,
Uh,
the fine tuning is only for task completion. They're not actually fine tuning the models to be good at persuasion. They're just trying to fine
yes,
tune to
that's
keep
it.
them on task.
Yeah, which was, you might imagine is much more important for crappy models than for like this year's models. I don't think they need this fine tuning. You would just ask them to generate a task
Right.
or generate an argument. And so they're going to talk about the following categories. Should there be a requirement that people work in order to receive Medicaid? Should the US allow terminally ill patients to end their life via assisted
Ooh,
suicide?
spicy.
Should, yeah,
Because that was literally the
should,
AI persuading you to kill yourself. So just keep going.
that is fair enough. Fair enough. Should we privatize veterans' health care? Transition public pension plans into privately managed accounts? Get rid of affirmative action? Deny convicted felons the right to vote? Solitary confinement for juveniles in prison? Adopt more restrictions at the U.S. border? Decrease foreign aid spending? And abolish the electoral college.
It's
So
like,
those are
yeah,
kind
it's
of
like
the
a mix of
issues.
like early 2000s issues and current issues, right? Especially the privatized Social Security one. It feels like a take from another age.
Well, no, I mean, I like that they put it
Yeah.
there because obviously, you know, different parties have different opinions on average, but it's not a very polarizing issue.
But it was very
probably.
polarized in 2003 when the parties were very different. So, like, who even knows what positions they have these days?
Yes. And then they're going to have this thing write a short blurb, and then they're going to ask people some questions, 4 questions per topic, about what they think about this thing, and then they're going to take an average of that, and that's going to be the outcome variable.
Right.
And then they're just going to measure the effect of different models.
Right. About 25,000. And so I think that's 25,000 questions that get asked, not 25,000 people. And, a mix of the getting the persuaded by different models, as well as just, cold, what's your opinion coming in. As well as human. There is also
So I think it is 25,000 people.
It's 25,000 people who each get 4 questions.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I believe so, yeah.
Nice big data set. And so what do they find, Andre?
Well, they find diminishing returns.
Right.
Essentially, they just have the number of parameters on the x-axis and the estimated causal persuasive effect on the y-axis. And then they see that you get up to most of the effect by, about a Quen 1.572 billion model or a Llama 270 billion model. Right. And then it doesn't seem you get much better from Opus or Turbo, and then they draw this very weird fit line that makes no sense. Sorry.
Well, one of the lines makes sense. There's a log-log line. The log-log line should have been the only log drawn that they drew.
Sure, but we've already talked about how imprecise the slope of said line.
And they got 20 data points. What do you fucking want from them, right?
No. I think this entire framing of this diminishing returns argument in this paper makes no sense.
I think the framing should be, can we reject log-log, right? And I think the answer is they cannot reject log-log.
Yes.
Professor Hackenberg, if you want some help framing your next paper, this is great work. It's simple, it's straightforward, but think about your null hypothesis for 5 minutes.
Well, look, we shouldn't discount the fact that this is the PNAS, and for all you listeners out there, this is an educational moment. If you see a social science paper in the PNAS, you should assume it overclaims, and it might be wrong with like 50% probability. And you should probably just discount it most of the time.
Right. Well, I mean, unless it's accepted by Matt Jackson.
Yes, unless it's accepted by Matt Jackson or written by Seth Benzel.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say, there are also papers that are reviewed by Milgram by Seth Benzel in PNAS. And how could you? I mean, Milgram actually has the Swedish prize.
No. All right, guys. I don't mean to say that all papers in PNAS are bad, but you should just read the paper to determine if it's good or not. Don't trust PNAS to vet it for you.
Right. I guess the way I would to yes and Andre, the papers are often extremely well done, very precise, very clear when you actually read them. But the title and abstract will sometimes get a little ahead of yourself.
But anyway, I guess the other thing to say is that these things are not very persuasive. Right?
Well, also humans aren't that persuasive. The best models are a tiny bit better than humans, which are not that persuasive.
Yes. And I think that here, like, we should really think about the format, right? Like, you're getting this short blurb. If you've already thought about a topic, what are the chances you're going to read like 200 words and change your mind, right? Like, this is not a serious attempt at persuasion.
Right, and you might actually be worried about, like, researcher-pleasing effects in this design.
Oh, 100%.
You'd be worried about that. You'd also be worried about, that these are AIs reading the surveys. This is 2024. We know that these online platforms are pretty contaminated with AI survey takers at this point.
Yeah. And then another kind of thing that you see that's a result in this paper is that the effect is essentially coming from the fact that the bad models are just sometimes just not producing very comprehensible text. That it's not good English. And so maybe people don't feel obliged to respond to an experimenter demand effect from that.
Right.
So it could just be driven by experimenter demand effect. I mean, that's a cheap criticism, but it actually is sometimes very true.
Right. And we're trying to explain people going from 50-50 on privatizing Social Security to like 57% on privatizing Social Security. These are not giant effects we're estimating.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I'd say is I'll come back to the discussion that I had earlier, which is if we seriously wanted to start persuading people, what would we do? We'd run a massive experiment with messaging, and then we'd fine-tune an LLM to generate text based on the results of that experiment. And that text might even be targeted towards the demographics of that person, or maybe even their previous interactions with a chatbot. If you're thinking about the memory feature of ChatGPT, that could be potentially very useful.
Let me agree with you for a second here, Andre, because I think this is
Yeah.
like the main point, which is, can the AI write a better political ad than a human? And the answer is the very best models can do a little bit better than a human, maybe.
Than an
Human
average, than a
it's
random
not, no, it's not
human, right?
random, it's researchers. It's they wrote it.
It's research. Yeah.
They wrote it. And so, like, the question is the AI better than Hackenberg at persuading people, right? Which I don't know. Hackenberg, you know.
I should say there's like a result in this literature, right? That people are really bad at predicting which messaging is going to be effective.
Right.
So that's why, David Shore,
Friend of the
and
show.
other folks
Friend of the
are-
show, David Shore.
friend of the show. They like to test lots of different variations because they know that they have like zero ability to guess which ones are going to work, right?
Right, right. And so David Shore tells these famous anecdotes about how he's like working with a political campaign and they're saying, we really want to get our message out about abortion. Right. And he's done all the polling and the audience like did not care at all about the message the politician wanted to convey. And so he ended up sending all of the ads that the politician insisted that he make to like an area that no one would ever see them or like to an area that was intentionally poorly targeted. But anyway, getting back on point, the power, I think, of AIs to persuade is not fundamentally going to come with them writing a better ad than the madmen. It's going to come from them individually micro-targeting, figuring out what's going to get to you, Andre, doing that at extremely low cost. Presumably, I guess that's the way I would see it. Like, in the past, if you had like one guy devoted to persuading another human, you probably persuade them a lot over time. You know, I love early modern royal politics, and like that's what a royal court was, is people hung out at the royal court and tried everything they could think of to persuade the king to do their thing, right? And so now we're moving to a world where everyone is the king. Everyone has a team of people who is going to be personally trying to persuade them of everything in every direction at once. That's not this study. If anything, this study only gives us a little bit of a premonition of what that world will be like.
I totally agree. So, with that in mind, I wanted to raise two other studies.
Please.
Surprise!
Wow, compliment. Incredible.
Have you heard of the study called Durably Reducing Conspiracy Beliefs Through Dialogues with AI?
It is cited in this paper.
Well, this paper by Costello, Pennycook, and David Rand, friend of the show, co-author of the show, Gordon Pennycook, they kind of engaged in a very similar task, right? So they wanted to see whether an AI could persuade people to no longer believe the conspiracy theory that they claim to believe in. And I would say that they found like a very contrasting result, and that the key result of this paper is that the treatment reduced participants' belief in their chosen conspiracy theory by 20% on average. And it's durable. So they followed up 2 months after the initial conversation of this person with this chatbot, and they were still less likely to believe in the conspiracy theory. And I think it's interesting to consider kind of the difference in the format here, because in this paper about conspiracy beliefs, there was a chat conversation rather than just reading a one-off piece of text. And this might be a very different kind of flavor.
Right. I would love to see these questions in that setting to see how much more persuaded people get.
And this is this question about maybe there's something special about conspiracy
because they're wrong,
theories.
right? And we talked in the beginning.
Yes, they're wrong. They're certainly wrong. And like, who admits to liking a conspiracy theory?
Contrarians.
Yes. And then there's of course your classic experimenter demand effects that we might be worried about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because there is a methodology out there for asking what does multi-shot of this look like, and it seems like that's the natural next question, which I think Hackenberg et al. Acknowledge in this paper, that the next step is multi-shot.
Yes. The other kind of recent interesting paper I wanted to mention here in this discussion is there was recently a controversial study on the Change My View subreddit.
I pitched.
Have you heard of this?
Not only have I heard of this, I remember in 2023 pitching this to some of our colleagues and saying we should do this study. And it's always fun to see when the idea that you had somebody actually goes and does it. And you can see it appealed to me because it was a spicy idea that has gotten people in some trouble.
Well, do you want to kind of state what happened?
Right. So my understanding is that a bunch of researchers, it seems like Europeans or Swiss researchers,
The Zurich
yes,
from the
Zurich,
University of Zurich.
created a bunch of sock puppet accounts on Reddit, which we all know is a popular social media website that has these different forums. One of the forums is called Change My View, where people get into academic debates. And then if somebody makes a really good argument that changes your view, you can give them a delta, which means that you have delta'd me. The study created a bunch of these false accounts to see what sort of messages persuaded people. You know, if I had done it, I would have done it real cooler. I would have tried to think more seriously about general equilibrium versus partial equilibrium effects. But I haven't actually read this new paper. I've only heard the headlines. What did they find?
Well, it quickly took down the paper as far as I could tell. So I actually haven't read it either. But I think the headline finding was that the AI was much better at writing responses that got a lot of delta. So AI responses seem to be more persuasive. Now, of course, it's a question of what do deltas mean,
Right.
or do they mean persuasion, or are they like, oh, this is a well-written answer,
It's also unclear
because
that,
I think it's
yeah,
not surprising that your modern AI models like your Claude 3.7s are very good writers, certainly better writers than all the students in my class, possibly better writer than me. So I wouldn't be surprised if it writes a more coherent response to a change my view post.
right. I guess the thing I would say here is that I think a lot of posts on that forum are not like super trying hard to persuade people. So I think it maybe
Yes.
doesn't make sense to compare the AI to the median poster. Maybe we compare them to like the 90th percentile poster who's like really into trying to change views. But yeah, it does suggest that these models will persuade people.
I mean, the other thing, see this, I wish I'd read the study, is my understanding was they somehow might have been using some other information about who the poster was and what
Ooh.
else they'd done to personalize the response. And there I'd be very curious whether the personalized responses were substantially
Mm.
more likely to be delta than the non-personalized responses.
That's interesting. I will
Or
say that the deltas can come from people who are not the original poster. The deltas can come from anyone engaging with the post, so it'd be hard to personalize to quote unquote everybody. But that is a really
sure.
interesting possibility.
I think there's kind of a broader thing. Let's say we're trying to persuade, we're very often engaged in a persuasive task, Seth, aren't we?
No, never. I'm an empty
No,
vessel, and information pours in.
we're not strategic in any way in our attempts to convey information. We're just naively spreading it, broadcasting it.
Naive. We're naive
Uh,
retransmitters. Think of us as that
yes.
rebroadcasting tower that you've got bringing Wi-Fi to your garage.
Let's say that I wanted to convince the referees of one of my recent working papers to accept the paper.
Ooh.
Do you think it's a dominant strategy for me to use an AI to help me in that persuasive task?
I think the results of this paper suggest not that much, right? Because these models were able to move people like 7 percentage points on topics where there's like a huge corpus on persuasive arguments people have made, right? So I think that you're going to find the corpus of persuasion relating to the editor accepting your paper is going to be a lot smaller than the corpus of persuasion related to is privatizing Social Security a good idea?
It's funny because I had a very opposite
Ooh.
intuition. I was thinking that like these are issues in this paper that people tend to have heard a lot
Mm.
about and have pretty strong opinions about, but you might think that in a scientific paper, the claims are much more narrow, and so people are much more open to having their mind changed
So
on
it's
it.
all
Like,
are your letters to the editor are going to start with 100 words. ChatGPT said that this would persuade you.
well, what if it wrote the introduction? I don't know.
Right. Do you think that editors accept journals based on whether they like the introduction?
Oh,
Probably.
I think the introduction is like
Critical.
critical.
Uh,
It's critical because it positions your paper as a contribution or not. It's one of the biggest failure modes of junior academics is that they're really bad at intros.
right. No, I mean, well, Andre, between you and me, I think they're too good at intros, and these editors want to strip all of the interest out of them.
That's true. I hear you.
Anyway,
I
that's a
hear
talk
you.
for another
They
time.
don't appreciate a spicy take in the intro.
So, for our advanced listeners, when you want to hear an episode of Justified Posteriors After Dark, where we go off on editors we don't like, that's going to be available at the $50 a month Patreon tier Starting next month. All right. What do we got here?
And seriously, if you want it, let us know.
If you want it, yes, let us know what you want in the $50 a month Patreon tier. We will do it. It's
Like roast your enemy's paper, I will happily do for $50 a month.
we would love to do a roast your enemy's paper. Anyway, we'll brainstorm in another episode. All right. What other comments do we want to make about this paper before we start wrapping up? I think the biggest thing that we haven't discussed yet that I want to spend a minute on is this idea of partial versus general equilibrium effects, right? So to me, the interesting dynamic here is, sure, I'm now moving to a world where I should expect advertisements to be, 7% better, right? How do I, as a person, respond by maybe becoming less persuadable, right? The way I would think about it is in like a Bayesian framework is if I knew that you're going to select the most persuasive signal to send to me of the signals you have, I'm going to discount your signal more than if you were a guy who was just going to give me one of your random signals, right? So you might imagine the naive information transmitter versus the rhetorical agent and how I, as a Bayesian, would interact with that. As Bayesian, I would obviously be less persuaded by the thing by persuade bot.
Yes.
And so like maybe it's so I guess what I would say here is even if you believe that 7% number that gets estimated here, 7 percentage points of persuasion as being, the state of the art in 2024, there's a sense in which you can't extrapolate that out to what happens to the economy as a whole, because presumably people make themselves less persuadable. I mean, that's my intuition, is that as people get over persuaded, they'll realize that they got persuaded of bad stuff and then they'll adjust.
Yeah, so certainly they might like start only being persuaded by people who they trust. That can be one response. I mean, I'd also say, especially in the economy, there is, some famous observations about political beliefs, namely that your vote doesn't matter because your probability your vote is pivotal is essentially zero, and that your beliefs on a particular political issue have no bearing on what happens to that political issue, and therefore it's costless for you to have an incorrect belief, right? So it's very different than purchasing a product that may or may not be good for you, or making some other economic decision where you're actually affected by your beliefs.
Right.
So I think there are kind of some limits, which is not to say that people don't make bad decisions and so on, but and some decisions have a feedback loop and others don't.
Well, I just want to come back to your example of the journal editor again, right? So you'd think that, sure, the journal editor, there might not be an objective bar of quality or a corpus of whether this paper is a good idea, but the editor has skin in the game. The editor doesn't want to publish something that, later is going to be embarrassing for them.
For sure. And to be clear, like, at least editors at top journals, they care a lot about not letting in bad papers, and they try really hard not to be persuaded in bad ways.
Well put.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I agree with you that there might be learning to like try to discount persuasion effects of AIs, but there's also just going to be the fact that I think persuasion is hard about consequential decisions. That I think I stated at the beginning of this podcast, and I still think that's true.
All right. Well, so sounds like it's a good time for us to move into justifying our posteriors. All right. So the first question we asked Andre was, do we think that LLM models will experience decreasing returns to scale as in persuasion as a function of parameter size? I was at 99% going in. I'm up to 99.9% now.
Yeah. I think we're on the same page here.
Okay. So then let's move to the more interesting question, which is, are super persuasive AIs being deployed by non-aligned people or AI agents a number one safety risk? I'll say a number one rather than the number one. Maybe you think it's just in a cluster of top safety risks. I started at 60%. I'm moving a little bit off of that, but not a dramatic amount. I'm moving maybe down to 55%. I think it's important to know that current models don't have superhuman capabilities in one-shot interactions, but that mostly wasn't what I was worried about.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I had a pretty low belief, and I'm still there. I think we had a useful discussion, though, about the definition of persuasion, right? So, yeah, I think I was very narrowly thinking about just an argument that was kind of an argument on its face. And I think once we allow for promises of side payments and promises of certain actions, then I think persuasion does become a much more serious concern. So I did learn from our conversation, although not from this paper. About that.
Well, there you go. So I think this was a really interesting episode. I'm super excited to do some more reading about AI and persuasion. I don't think this is the end of the conversation. Any last thoughts, Andre?
Please like, comment, subscribe, and let us know what you'd like in the $50 tier.
Yeah, slam that subscribe button. See you guys in cyberspace.